So welcome to the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum Virtual Speaker Series for April 2024. My name is Dr. Emily Bamforth. We are really glad today to welcome our virtual speaker for today, Dr. Corwin Sullivan from the University of Alberta. Corwin actually comes up and does a whole bunch of work with us here at the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum in the summer. So we're very familiar with him and his work with the Boreal Alberta Dinosaur Project. So today, Corwin will be talking about a new fossil that was found from up here in the Grand Prairie area in the last couple of years. So I'll let Corwin take it away.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Emily, for that kind introduction. So yes, as Emily mentioned, I'm based essentially at the University of Alberta, but I come up every summer to the Grand Prairie area and do field work, mostly in the waterways of the area, the Wapiti River, Nose Creek, and many others, just because exposure tends to occur along riverbanks in this heavily forested part of the world. Uh, um, the Grand Prairie area has been known for quite some time as a source of fossils, in fact, since the early 1900s, but scientific investigation of the late Cretaceous dinosaurs that come from the rocks around Grand Prairie has really accelerated in the past few decades as the result of the Royal Tyrrell Museum, what's now Northwestern Polytechnic in Grand Prairie, and many other collectors, now including my group at the University of Alberta, and of course the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum. And some of a range of notable finds have already been made. The specimen you're seeing here is called Edmontosaurus, is a specimen of the duck-billed dinosaur Edmontosaurus regalis. It's a very notable specimen in that it preserves evidence that a soft tissue crest was present on top of the head. That's not reflected at all in the structure of the skull, which is flat, but the preservation of soft tissue shows us that this dinosaur was indeed crested, and the only evidence for this comes from this specimen, which is from a site called Red Willow Falls, somewhat to the west of Grand Prairie. Pachyrhinosaurus lacusti is the iconic dinosaur of the Wapiti Formation, which is what the late Cretaceous rocks around Grand Prairie are called, at least most of them. Pachyrhinosaurus lacusti comes only from the Pipestone Creek bonebed, very familiar to staff at the Curry Museum. They excavate there every summer, expanding our sample of Pachyrhinosaurus lacusti, and they're continuing to make interesting finds of this very unusual horned dinosaur. There are also fossil footprints in the Grand Prairie area. This is a nicely preserved tyrannosaurid track from the Red Willow River, and many other finds. This is a duck-billed dinosaur dentary bone, sort of standing in for the many random bits and pieces that we find as we do field work in the region. I'm fortunate enough to be able to work on these dinosaurs and other fossils of the Wapiti Formation with a brilliant team of collaborators, very diverse in their interests and expertise, and including Emily, who of course needs no introduction. In fact, she introduced me, but she's the curator of the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum. Phil Bell is from the University of New England, which you'd think would be in Maine or New Hampshire. It's actually in Armidale, New South Wales, Australia. And Phil is an expert on duck-billed dinosaurs in particular. He's very interested in preservation of soft tissue, but really an all-round very good paleontologist. Nick Campione is Canadian, but works with Phil at the University of New England. Nick is very quantitative. Whenever I have a question about statistics, he's the first person I talk to. Federico Fanti is a geologist based at the University of Bologna in Italy. He probably understands the stratigraphy of the Wapiti Formation and the ancient environment better than just about anyone else. So he comes over and helps with the geological aspect of our work when he can. Robin Sissons is integral to the whole enterprise. She's employed essentially as a technician at the University of Alberta, but her role goes well beyond that. She's involved in every aspect of our science, from planning the field work to writing and publishing the eventual papers, but she is the person mainly responsible for preparing the fossils, that is, for cleaning the rock off them and getting them into shape to study. I'm me. And Matt Vavrick is a very good paleontologist, trained to the PhD level, but actually resident in Grand Prairie. So he's the member of the team, along with Emily now, who can go out locally and find things. And Matt will just go out on weekend canoe trips, weekend hiking trips, and see what he can find. So he's probably found more of our important specimens than any other member of the team. So that's the group, and we call our effort, sort of half jokingly, the Boreal Alberta Dinosaur Project, or if you prefer, Bad P. And here we are, outside the dorms at what's now Northwestern Polytechnic, what was formerly Grand Prairie Regional College. And the Polytechnic has been really good about letting us stay in their dorms for free every summer when we do our field work. And that's a huge logistical contribution to our ability to do field work in the region. So thank you, Northwestern Polytechnic. Now, one major aim of our field work is to go a little bit beyond dinosaur paleontology and get a better idea of the environment in which the dinosaurs existed and what other organisms were sharing that environment with them. As part of this, Emily is really leading the charge on an investigation of the paleobotany of the region. She and other crew members have identified a number of sites that are producing promising plant material, and we're gradually building up a sample of fossil leaves and fossil fronds and even fossil cones that will be helpful in giving us an idea of what the plant life of the region was like, and therefore what the paleo environment was like. We're also, however, interested in smaller vertebrates, the little turtles and mammals and other things that coexisted with the dinosaurs. And this is where a locality called the DC Bonebed comes in. And the DC Bonebed, I think at this point, is my favorite fossil locality in the world. It's not the most important fossil locality in the world. It's not even the most important fossil locality in Alberta. It's arguably not even the most important fossil locality in the Grand Prairie area, but it's a site that I've had a lot of direct involvement with over the years, and some important specimens are coming to light there and starting to really tell us quite a bit more about what the late Cretaceous ecosystem in the Grand Prairie area was like. So the DC Bonebed is basically a mud hole. I spend a significant amount of time sitting in this mud hole every summer, as do other field crew members. And it's on the bank of the Wapiti River, actually relatively close to Grand Prairie, so it's not a difficult site to get to particularly. And what the DC Bonebed is fundamentally is a deposit that formed in an ancient river. So you can imagine an ancient Cretaceous river intersecting the trajectory of the modern Wapiti River, so that the ancient riverbed, you can think of this as a fossil riverbed, is exposed in cross-section on the bank of the Wapiti. And if we look at a geological section, and this is Federico Fanti's work, you can see successive rock deposits that were laid down in this ancient channel. And fossils occur throughout the channel, but there's a concentration of them here, which I've labeled microvertebrates. And this is a point bar deposit, or maybe a series of point bar deposits in this ancient channel, where we find a mixture of small vertebrate bones and teeth. That's not the only thing we find in the paleo channel. Another thing I've noted is the site of a partial hadrosaurid skeleton, a partial duckbill dinosaur skeleton that we excavated back in 2017, and which turns out to have a relatively nice skull. It's something that Robin and I, and Nick and Phil in particular, are currently working on writing up for publication. It's some sort of small lambeosaurine, juvenile lambeosaurine hadrosaurid, for those of you who know your hadrosaurs. But for me, yes, and excavating the DC Bonebed involves an unusual method. At most dinosaur bone beds, the bones are relatively large and robust. These are two of our sites, Deadfall Hills and Spring Creek, where we get fairly big, solid dinosaur bones. And the standard approach at this site, the best practice, if you like, is to expose each bone completely, at least on one side, dig around it so we have a very good idea of what we are collecting. And then once it's exposed, we can make the decision on whether or not it's worthwhile to put it in a plaster jacket, as we do, and take it back to the lab for study. That doesn't work particularly well at the DC Bonebed because the specimens at the DC Bonebed, these small vertebrate bones and teeth that we find, are so small and so delicate that attempts to expose them completely usually result in their destruction. So we practice what I kind of think of as mystery box paleontology when when we see bone in the DC bone bed, so we know we've got some kind of fossil. We try to collect it without exposing very much, but we get a rough idea of its size and shape. And then once we've got that, we dig around it, we extract it, and take it back to the lab with a lot of sediment still around it. And then Robin Sissons, who's shown here, actually preparing the Lambeosaurian skull I mentioned, Robin Sissons will clean it up and figure out what it is. And very often it's just a little shard of bone, just a little uninformative fragment that doesn't tell us anything. So we collect a lot of those by mistake. But sometimes what's inside the mystery box is a lot nicer. So things we've found from the DC bone bed include, for example, armor plates from sturgeons. This is the snout of an unusual fish called Belanostomus, which had very long, slender jaws. This is a piece of turtle shell, a crocodilian tooth, vertebra from a duck-billed dinosaur, a hip bone. This is actually quite a rare and special one, a hip bone from a type of dinosaur closely related to birds called a caenignathed. So this is the kind of material we're finding. Just bits and pieces, a bit of this, a piece of that, but quite diverse and often quite well preserved. So we can really get a lot of information from these individual fossils. And one specimen that we brought back, and which Robin prepared back in 2018, I believe, maybe 2017, was this skull bone we see here. Shown in several views. And at first, it was pretty clear to us that this was a skull bone. We weren't sure what it was a skull bone of, but looking at this, flipping through literature, comparing it to things, convinced us pretty quickly that we were dealing with the skull bone of some kind of lizard. Just its overall shape indicated that the fact that it wasn't fused to the opposite skull bone, that happens in some lizards, but not all lizards, whereas in certain other groups like crocodilians, it happens more consistently. The articular facets that we see on this bone for other things, we got as far pretty quickly as realizing that it was characteristic of lizards and also that it was a particular bone called the frontal. And this is a bone from the middle of the skull roof. I've just superimposed here the frontal from the DC bone bed on a random illustration of a lizard skull to show the position of the frontal in the skull. There's one additional lizard bone that we've identified so far from the DC bone bed. It's an ankle bone, a very distinctive type of ankle bone from some kind of big lizard. And interestingly, these specimens were collected on successive days, 1 July. So they were presumably close to each other in the bone bed, although we didn't map their locations. And that suggests that they might possibly be from the same species and even the same individual lizard, because they both come from a lizard that's relatively large. However, we can't definitively say that they are from the same individual, and it turns out that lizard ankle bones are not really all that informative. They don't vary that much from one lizard to another, so this ankle bone can't tell us much. On the other hand, frontal bones do vary a lot from one lizard to another, so we knew that there was some possibility of finding out what kind of lizard we had in the DC bone bed. And a graduate student of mine at the time, Sam Hamilton, although she was working mostly on dinosaur forelimbs, decided to take on this lizard bone as a bit of a side project. She decided she'd write a description of it, working together with another graduate student, Ilaria Paparella, who was working with my colleague Michael Caldwell. And Sam and Ilaria have both since finished their studies and moved on to other things. But we had a recent publication on this frontal bone that was led by Sam and with Ilaria involved too, of course, along with the Bad P team, me and another collaborator I'll get to. And it's really the content of that paper that I'm going to be discussing for the remainder of this talk. The first step was to try to figure out what kind of lizard we had, because of course lizards in the modern world are quite diverse. There are chameleons, very unusual lizards, famous for the ability of some species to change color. Iguanas are big herbivorous lizards, at least typically pretty big. The monitors, like this young Komodo dragon, are formidable predators. And you might not think of snakes as lizards, but in a sense, snakes actually are. Snakes evolved from among the diversity of lizards. They lost their limbs and evolved a very modified skull, very flexible. And in the way we now think about classification, that means that snakes are a special kind of lizard. So this is just a glimpse of modern lizard diversity, but the point being that there are many different kinds of lizard, and we had to work out what sort of lizard we had. And Alaria, in particular, soon honed in on evidence that our lizard belonged to a group that is officially, to scientists, known as the Monstersauria. And there are only two members of this group, Monstersauria, alive today. The more famous of the two, well, two major kinds, let's say. The more famous kind is the Gila monster, or Gila monster, if you want to say it the Spanish way, species name Heloderma suspectum. And then there are a few closely related species of beaded lizard. This is the Mexican beaded lizard shown here, but there are Heloderma horridum, it's called, but there are a few other kinds. And as you might expect from these species names, suspectum and horridum, these lizards aren't the prettiest or most cuddly animals in the world. They're quite big lizards. The Gila monster gets up over half a meter. Beaded lizards can be even bigger. The biggest species can get over 80 centimeters. So lizards pushing a meter in total body length. They're famous for being somewhat venomous. They have a venom gland in the lower jaw. The venom isn't really dangerous to a healthy adult human, except in cases of being allergic to the venom or having some additional factor like that. But being bitten by one of these lizards and envenomated is very painful. And they also have little knobs of bone, which are called osteoderms, all over their bodies, which gives them their beaded or knobbly appearance. And in the skull region, the osteoderms, as they're called, will actually fuse to the skull, and their function, of course, is to provide some armor, some protection for the animal. There was a lot of controversy back in the 19th century over whether these lizards really were venomous or whether their bite just tended to be infectious. And one contributor to this debate, and I'm bringing this in just for fun, one contributor to the debate was this guy, Robert Shufelt, who started his career as an army surgeon but was always interested in zoology. He eventually published a number of important works on modern and fossil birds. In some ways, he was actually quite an unpleasant man, or became one in later life. But when he was younger, he left a rather charming account of being bitten by a Gila monster. And the Gila monster belonged to a friend of his who was also a naturalist, and Shufelt was handling it, and the lizard got irritated. So Shufelt wrote, "The now highly indignant and irritated Heloderma," using the genus name there, "made a dart forward and seized my right thumb in his mouth." And then he described severe shooting pains up my arm and down the corresponding side. But as an army surgeon, he knew how to treat himself. This caused him to become so faint as to fall. The perspiration flowed profusely. So a small quantity of whiskey was administered. And Shufelt was fine, and he ended up concluding, despite his symptoms, that he probably had just been infected. So he actually argued against these animals being venomous, but it was demonstrated some years later, I believe right around the turn of the 20th century, if I remember rightly, that they definitely did have actual venom and not just an infectious bite. So those are the living monstersaurs, and the term Monstersauria encompasses those species and their relatives going right back to the Cretaceous. And there's good evidence that our lizard bone from the DC Bonebed, this is its specimen number up here, is indeed one of these monstersaurs. For one thing, it's paired, right? The two frontals are not fused, and that's typical of Cretaceous monstersaurs to have the two frontals separate. So that's one feature. Right? This is a right frontal. It's not fused to the left frontal. There's a crest on the underside of the frontal. It's called the crista cranii. This is This occurs throughout lizards, but it's developed to different degrees. Our frontal has a large crestocranii that isn't so large that it comes together with the opposite crest. And that condition, having a crestocranii that's large but doesn't meet the opposite crest, is what you'd expect in a monstersaur, but rules out a number of other lizards. The key characteristic, though, is the presence of osteoderms, and not just osteoderms in general, but osteoderms that are solidly fused to the frontal bone. We CT scan the specimen, and there's no line of contact present. The bone is just continuous, showing that the osteoderms are fused right onto the frontal, as in the modern Gila monster and beaded lizards and other monstersaurs. Then we have the osteoderms are also, in terms of shape, similar to those of other monstersaurs in having what I call a ridge and pit type of ornamentation, also in being large and somewhat polygonal. Along with the characteristics I mentioned earlier, like the paired frontals as we see in this monstersaur, Gobiderma, that suggests that we really are dealing here with a monstersaur and not a member of some other group. It has an interesting and specific resemblance, our little DC monster, as I call it, to another monstersaur, which is known from the Late Cretaceous of Montana and from near a site, Egg Mountain, so we can call this one the Egg Mountain monster. And this is it's much more complete than our DC monster. It's represented by a partial skeleton, including this skull. And if we look closely at the frontals, they're very similar to the frontal from the DC Bonebed. Even the exact pattern of osteoderms has some similarities. If you look at this part with a triangular osteoderm in front on each frontal, and then other more oblong ones behind it. This egg mountain monster has never been described in the scientific literature, but this gentleman, Michael Balsai, wrote a PhD thesis about it back in 2001. It's just that thesis has never been published. So I got in touch with Michael. He agreed to work with us on our DC monster, and we came to the conclusion that these were indeed very similar animals based on their similar frontals, and that probably they represented the same species. It's possible that species should be called Paleosanewa canadensis. Paleontologists often argue over exactly which taxonomic names are appropriate for which specimens, and to me that issue is less interesting than just noting that these two lizards, one from the Cretaceous of Alberta, one from the Cretaceous of Montana, do seem to belong to the same species. We can also compare our DC frontal to a partial frontal from White Rock Coulee in southern Alberta, which is also Monstersaurian, and seems to belong to a different kind of monstersaur. This White Rock Coulee monster has osteoderms that are more clearly polygonal than those of the DC monster, and they have a simple pitted pattern, not the ridge and pit ornamentation seen in the DC monster. And furthermore, the surface for articulating with the other frontal is much thicker in the case of our White Rock Coulee monster, suggesting that we have a second monstersaur species present in the Cretaceous of Montana. The White Rock Coulee monster should arguably be called Labrodioctes montanensis. Again, what name you give it is less important from my perspective than the biological facts, which are that we seem to have two monstersaur species, one in the, both in the Cretaceous of Alberta, at least one of them extending into Montana. And it's the biology of these things that really interests me. And one important aspect of biology is body size. One can't determine body size exactly from just one isolated frontal, but it's possible to come up with an estimate by looking at the proportions of relatives that are more completely known. And one relative known from complete skulls like this one is Astesia from the Cretaceous of Mongolia. And in Astesia, the ratio of the length of the frontal to the length of the skull is about 3.85. So that's good to know. And if we're willing to go a bit further, there are figures in the literature saying that in a young male Komodo dragon, so not a monstersaur, but a close relative, the ratio of the length of the skull to the length of the body is about 11.27 if you do the calculation. So if we multiply those two ratios, we get a ratio of body length to frontal length in this approximate kind of lizard of 43.39. If we multiply that number by the length of the frontal from the DC bonebed, which is 35 millimeters, a bit smaller than in Astesia, that gives us a body length estimate of about 1.5 meters for our DC monster. This is a very back of the envelope calculation. Of course, some lizards are short and thick bodied, some are long and thin bodied. So we can't say that the DC monster was necessarily 1.5 meters long, but I'd be quite surprised if it were much less than a meter or much more than 2 meters, right? This gives us an idea that it was a large lizard and larger, in fact, than any monstersaur alive today. Another interesting biological issue is the possible presence of venom, right? We know that modern monstersaurs are venomous. Would this have been true of the DC monster? Well, one indicator of the presence of venom is what are called venom grooves, and these are grooves on the lower teeth along which the venom flows in modern monstersaurs, but also in Astesia. Astesia and some other fossil monstersaurs have quite clear venom grooves, indicating that they were certainly venomous. We don't have teeth for the DC monster, but we do have a few lower teeth for the Egg Mountain monster, the Montana form that probably represents the same species. Apologies for the image quality here. These are old black and white photos from Michael Balsai's thesis, but Balsai was very definite in the thesis about no clear, or he said unmistakable, but no really clear indication of venom grooves being present. So we don't have grooved teeth in the Egg Mountain monster, which suggests that perhaps it wasn't venomous. Perhaps this animal is representing a stage of monstersaur evolution before venom had evolved. However, there are a couple of caveats there. It's possible that the kind of potent venom that we see in modern monstersaurs actually evolved before this sophisticated delivery system involving grooves. So maybe it was venomous without the teeth being grooved, although that would be quite difficult to prove. But it's also the case that quite a number of lizards that are closely related to monstersaurs, including actually monitor lizards like the Komodo dragon, do seem to have a very mild form of venom. So this kind of mild venom was probably present in our DC monster, even if the potent venom, like that seen in modern monstersaurs, wasn't there. The final paleobiological issue that I'd like to address is the kind of habitat that the DC monster would have occupied. And to get an idea of that, we need to look at the geography of North America back in the Cretaceous, when sea levels were so high that seawater had spilled onto the middle of the North American continent, dividing the continent into western and eastern land masses and creating what's called the Western Interior Seaway. And at that time, so we're going back about 73 million years ago, which is roughly when the DC bonebed would have been deposited. That's here on our timescale. The Grand Prairie area was on the east coast of the western landmass, right? So quite near the Western Interior Seaway. So we can think of the DC monster and other things from the Wapiti Formation as inhabiting a coastal lowland. Now, modern monstersaurs favor very particular habitats. The beaded lizards tend to live in what's called seasonally dry tropical forest. It's a particular type of forest that can be quite wet during the rainy season, but then dries out during the non-rainy season. And these forests occur in western Mexico in particular. And then the Gila monster occurs in more desert and scrubland environments in the southwestern United States and into northwest Mexico. So they range geographically from Guatemala down here up into southern Utah and Nevada. That's about the northern limit of their range. And around that northern limit, the mean annual temperature, right? So temperature average throughout the year tends to be around 17 degrees Celsius. Further south, it tends to be higher. So the mean annual temperature of modern monstersaur habitats is around 17 degrees and up. And an interesting thing about these habitats is that they tend to be they tend to be quite seasonal, but in different ways, right? In the northern end of the range, the habitat can be a bit seasonally cold, not necessarily by Alberta standards, but there is nevertheless a colder season. Whereas seasonally dry tropical forests, as the name implies, have a very pronounced dry season. In fact, in some cases, a drought season that many things have difficulty surviving. And it's been suggested that these living monstersaurs fill an ecological niche that depends on their ability to survive harsh seasonal conditions. That they're particularly good at that by limiting their energy expenditure during the harsh season, whether it's a cold season or a dry season. And by being particularly good at that, they're able to maintain their ecological position against competitors. So there's this association of monstersaurs and seasonal environments in the modern world. And parenthetically, while we're talking about the range of the monstersaur, of modern monstersaurs extending into Utah and Nevada, I'll note that it has some cultural relevance in that part of the world. The mascot of the Las Vegas Golden Knights is a humanoid Gila monster. Maybe someday there will be a Grand Prairie hockey team that has the DC monster as its mascot. In any case, just to burnish my scientific credentials, I'm going to close here with a couple of graphs. This is a graph showing estimated paleolatitude of the Grand Prairie area throughout a large stretch of geological time. Of course, continents have drifted around on the Earth, so the geographic position of the Grand Prairie area has changed over time, but it's estimated that back in the Late Cretaceous, about 73 million years ago, the Grand Prairie area would have been at a latitude of about 63 degrees north, somewhat higher than its present latitude of 55 degrees. And of course, being at 63 degrees puts us just outside the Arctic Circle, which would be 63, or the Arctic Circle being at 66 degrees. So the Grand Prairie area was really a subarctic environment by definition, right, just outside the Arctic Circle, back in the Late Cretaceous, because of its geographic position. That's convenient because colleagues who work on geochemistry have used information from preserved isotopes to come up with a temperature gradient for the Late Cretaceous. And so this is a graph of mean annual temperature versus latitude, right? And in the modern world, this is the modern gradient. It's quite steep, right? If you let's start at low latitude near the equator. As you move higher in latitude, as you move towards the poles, mean annual temperature eventually starts to taper off relatively steeply until you get into colder conditions at higher temperatures. Whereas in the Late Cretaceous, that gradient existed, but it was quite a bit gentler, right? A gradual decline with latitude, and the decline with latitude in mean annual temperature stayed gentle. So even at relatively high latitudes, the mean annual temperature still was not extreme. And at a paleolatitude of about 63 degrees, this graph estimates that the mean annual temperature would have been around 9 degrees centigrade. 9 degrees is not that warm, but it's a good deal warmer than the Grand Prairie area is today. The mean annual temperature in Grand Prairie from the 1980s to 2010 was 2.2 degrees. So the environment, despite being at a higher latitude, right, was a fair bit warmer than today. However, being at high latitude, it was still seasonally dark. Outside the Arctic Circle, there wouldn't quite have been days of complete darkness, but in the winter, there would have been days that were darn close. And at least on a seasonal basis, this environment was quite wet. My collaborators and I like to use the word waterlogged to describe the conditions. We also have reasonably good climate information for the Egg Mountain monster down in the Late Cretaceous of Montana. Mean annual temperature there was somewhat higher, but that environment is thought to have been prone to seasonal droughts. They didn't happen every year, but they're thought to have happened regularly. So this suggests, interestingly, that maybe even back in the Late Cretaceous, monstersaurs were associated in some way with seasonal habitats. Maybe being able to cope with seasonality was an important part of their biology, something that may have given them an edge over competitors going back to the Late Cretaceous. But the larger message here is that Subarctic Alberta, back in the Late Cretaceous, was relatively warm. and supported quite a diverse fauna, including things like turtles, like crocodilians, like a big lizard, right? Things that in the modern world are only found at kind of low to moderate latitudes. Crocodilians and big lizards certainly don't occur in Canada, right, today. And of course, there were dinosaurs in the environment too. So a lush, diverse ecosystem existing under relatively mild climatic conditions. And together with Emily and my other Bad P colleagues, I'll be going into the field this summer and hopefully learning a little bit more about what that environment and its fauna were like. So I'll stop there. Here are some acknowledgments, people who have helped with this research in various ways, and institutions that have supported us. And thanks very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. Gila monsters are certainly not something that you would expect to find this far north, at least today, but it's really cool that we have them in the fossil record. And as you say, really important implications for paleo environment. There's a couple of questions in the chat here. One of them is about how do you find fossils in different rocks in the field? Kind of a
Uh,
broad question there.
yeah, well, you walk around and you keep your eyes open. Of course, if a fossil is completely buried in the rock, you're not going to see it. So what we're looking for are fossils that either have just eroded out so that they're still intact enough to pick up and collect, or better yet, a fossil that's just starting to erode out. And when we see a fossil that's just starting to erode out of the rock, we can dig around it and see how complete it is, see if there are any other fossils in the vicinity. And if we're really lucky, that fossil that we saw sticking out will be just one fossil from a site that has numerous fossils, right? A whole bone bed potentially. And we can then excavate the bone bed systematically and start to reveal fossils that weren't apparent at the surface. But we can only do that when we kind of know where to dig. And we know where to dig because we see something starting to come out of the rock.
Was the Egg Mountain site, is that the Myosaurus site in Montana?
I believe so. Yes, it's not a site that I'm personally familiar with, but I think that's the one. Yeah.
Okay. And that is same age as Wapiti or young?
Approximately. Yeah. I don't know precisely, but it's the same overall part of the Late Cretaceous.
Okay, cool. I have a question about the function of those osteoderms in monstersaurs. Do we know what they did, why they had them?
I think just for protection. And actually, that's probably also the reason that monstersaurs have venom today. They don't use it for predation. They use it to defend themselves if they feel threatened, like the Gila monster did when Shufelt was handling it. So the osteoderms, I think, are another layer of protection, right? It's a hard crust of little bony knobs in the skin, and it would be resistant to biting and other kinds of damage.
So presumably the same for the fossil ones, although I guess we never know, but
Not for sure, but I would presume that. And I think that that's usually a pretty good default assumption when something has what appears to be armor, right? When it has a lot of bone in the skin, that's more likely to be armor than anything else, especially since it takes some energy to produce bone in the skin, right? And then it takes some energy to carry it around. So animals aren't going to do that without a good reason. And I think the most obvious reason to have plates of bone in the skin is to provide physical protection.
how many other kinds of lizards are there? Presumably
Uh,
from the late Cretaceous.
Yes, well, from the Wapiti Formation, in particular, there are two. There's Socognathus unicuspis and Clusconsaurus grandprairiensis, they're called, and they're both known from a site called Cluskin Hill, which is to the northeast of the town of Grand Prairie. It's quite a special site because most of our sites are along riverbeds in the area. Cluskin Hill is actually a small patch of badlands, the northernmost badlands in Alberta, and some of those badlands have some of those, the hills that make up those badlands have little like patches of exposed rock where one can find again small fossil bones and teeth. And quite a few lizard specimens over the years, in fact, have come from Kleskin Hill. There's only one, I believe, that is identified as Kleskinsaurus grandprairiensis. The other species, Socognathus unicuspis, seems to be the more common one. And the first fossil ever described in the scientific literature from the Grand Prairie area was a little piece of lizard jaw from Kleskin Hill, which was identified as something else at the time, but is probably just Socognathus.
Hmm. And I guess like a follow-up question too is, if it was much warmer in the Cretaceous, why don't we find more lizards?
Well, that's a very good question. I think one reason is just that even big lizards are small vertebrates compared to dinosaurs, for example. So their skeletons are relatively delicate. And in most fossil sites, there's a ferocious bias against preservation of small and delicate things because they're being preserved in rivers and other relatively high energy environments. So small vertebrates often get destroyed rather than entering the fossil record. But I'm optimistic that as we continue to work more at the DC Bonebed and other sites, more lizard material will start to come through and we'll get a better idea of the diversity of lizards that existed. They're a really interesting group, as I've discovered by working on the DC monster.
Just a kind of a general paleo question for you.
Mhm.
Um, Someone is interested in working in paleontology and wants to study and work in a museum, but they live in Mexico, so they're wondering how do you come to study paleontology in Alberta?
Oh, well, the University of Alberta has an undergraduate paleontology program, which I think is one of the best in the world. We have students from Mexico and countries around the world. So, and they're more and more universities, I would say, that teach paleontology. I don't know if there are any paleontology programs in Mexico. There are certainly very good Mexican paleontologists, and Mexico has an interesting fossil record. There are actually dinosaurs of about the same age as the ones we have in Alberta from Mexico. So there's lots to do in that country. But I would say I don't know what stage the person asking the question is at, but a good step towards a career in a museum would be either an undergraduate degree in paleontology or one in some combination of biology and geology, followed by graduate school to become a paleontologist. So it's a path that a lot of us have walked and found very rewarding, and I'd encourage the person asking the question to pursue it.
So I don't see any other questions coming through. So thanks again to Dr. Sullivan for his time, a really, really interesting talk. And I think I can echo him in saying that I'm sure more exciting things will come out of northern Alberta. So keep your ears open for new finds from this region. Um, we will have a virtual speaker series in May to be announced, and then we're going to take a break in the summer, and we'll start again in September. So we'll hope you'll be able to join us for those. Of course, if you missed part of this presentation and want to see it again, you can find this on the recording of this talk on our YouTube channel. So thanks again for joining us today.